Be needing this.
The Elder Scrolls has a habit of doing weird things with its gods, and one of its main names weirdly has many names. Lorkhan, Lorkhaj, Shezzar, Shor, Sheor, Sep, the patron of humanity, the corpse god, the missing god, the dark moon, and the doom drum. He is and has been many things, and is the polar opposite of his twin, Akatosh, the dragon god of time. Thus, some have dubbed him the god of space, all Pokemon Palkia and Dialga style, but there is so much more to this. And while he's technically been dead for almost all of Tamriel's history, Lorkhan, Shezzar, Shor, or whatever you want to call him, has managed to still greatly influence the world of Nirn. His handprints are all over the Elder Scrolls series, and while Skyrim has Nord shouting about Talos and has a Dragonborn blessed by Akatosh, this missing god still pulls the strings in the afterlife. So let's have a look at the corpse god, and talk about how we, the Last Dragonborn, might in fact be this missing god.
In the name of Shor, and in the name of Atmora of old, you are Ysmir now, the dragon of the north.
So, before we begin in earnest, let's settle on a name to use, and I have decided that we will be working with Shor. Lorkhan is probably the most common name, but Lorkhan is also his elven name, and one given by those who are his enemy, which will make sense later. Shor is a name from his people, the Atmorans and Nords, and thus I would assume it better to represent him with. Plus, we're using Skyrim gameplay for B-roll, so his Nordic name makes the most sense to me. Now, who or what is Shor? Well, he's a god, although it seems to be contested as to whether he is Aedra. In some ways, he is the Aedra, and in others, he doesn't really fit the mould. Aedra typically referred to the 8 great spirits who followed Shor and created Mundus, which is kinda why they refer to him as the Aedra in some ways. But the manner in which he got many of these Aedra to follow him is the reason he is also kinda not one at the same time. You see, there were many divine beings floating about before Mundus, the universe I guess you could call it, was created, and these beings are broadly known as the Et Arda, or the original beings. These included the Daedra, whom Shor couldn't convince to help make Mundus, the Aedra, and the Magna Gi, whom Shor could convince. The thing is, Shor is considered to be quite the trickster by the elves, and he got his reputation by tricking the Aedra and the Magna Gi to start making the world, with Magnus, who you might know from his eye here, being the architect of this world. But you might be thinking, Nox, why did Shor need to trick these guys? All he was asking was to make a world. It's really in keeping with what gods do, which was well within their power. Well, that has to do with the sacrifice required to make this world. Creating Mundus required that these Et Arda give up some of their power so that the world could be created, which is something that not all were willing to give up. We aren't sure on the percentage of the power given, and it seems to range from Et Arda to Et Arda, which we'll expand on later, but Magnus, who was the architect, did not sign up for that. Probably swore at Shor profusely, then skyrocketed himself out of Magnus. In doing so, he made a big old hole in the sky, and that was where we got the sun. With the Mundus project without its architect, the Et Arda called a meeting known as the Convention, to basically discuss how much of a sneaky sod Shor had been. Many had decided not to give up any more of their power and followed Magnus's lead, forming the stars on their exit, which is probably where they got the Magna Gi name from. Which, I mean, did no one think to make a door? Did you have to burst through the sky? Was that the only way out? Also, does this mean that everyone was working in the dark until now because there was no sun? How are we going to get light in? What's up with that? Anyway, back on topic. Those who remained decided to see the project out, with Akatosh assumably taking charge. Things get complicated with Akatosh, admittedly, and I'd argue it's more complicated than with Shor here, but I've got a whole video on that. You don't necessarily need it for this video, so don't worry, and some gave themselves so completely to the world that they became the very laws of nature, following the lead of Ifrei, the tree guy that the Bosmer, like Ori here, love. He tells them to be cannibals and everything. Wonderful guy. These lot were known as the Earthbones, while those who decided to only give a fraction of their power are known as the Elnafey, although there is a bit of confusion here. Elnafey translates to Earthbones, but Kirkbride seems to use them to denote two different types of Adric spirits, so in Kirkbride we trust, I guess? Do we still hang on every word he's ever written, even if it's on a McDonald's napkin? We still doing that? Okay. But back to Shor. While people were still willing to see the project out, his deception was a problem. It had weakened the Aedra, and while some were presumably in on the plan from the start, like Kyne, Shor's wife, and Stun, one of his thanes, who later gets rebranded as Stendar, most weren't. Apparently, some Elnafey were becoming mortal, and thus the elves were created, and these elves appealed to their king, Akatosh, or rather Auriel, to do something about it. So, after the convention, where basically the world and the rules were decided, Auriel had his champion, Trinimac, rip out Shor's heart, and then he used his bow, which we spend half of Dawnguard looking for, to shoot the heart into the sea, which later formed the island of Vardenfell in Morrowind. Of course, Shor didn't go without a fight, at least according to the Nords, and Sun, aka Whalebone Boy over here, was slain in the fighting. Atmora got shattered, I think, but long story short, Shor ends up dead after this, now heartless, and not the Kingdom Hearts kind. Apparently, some Metada sought to destroy Shor's heart, but they couldn't because it was linked to Nirn itself and was basically the world's heart. One way I like to think about this is that the Aedra have their own planets in Mundus, away from Nirn. Lorkhan has a planet called Lorkhan and so on and so forth, and that Nirn, the planet Tamriel is in, is the world of Shor. The thing is, Shor's a divine being, and death doesn't quite mean the same thing to him as it would to us mere mortals.
What a fool you are. I'm a god. How can you kill a god? What a grand and intoxicating innocence.
In Elder Scrolls, whenever someone kicks the bucket, their soul goes to a certain realm in either Aetherius or Oblivion, depending on who got the final dibs. The thing is, Shor kinda keeps turning up in history despite being dead. Yes, he exists in his own realm, Sovngarde, where his champion, Sun, still hangs out, but unlike Sun, he makes a few appearances on Nirn despite his death. He does this in two ways, either appearing as an avatar or a spirit of some kind, or as a mortal. We'll get into the mortal reincarnation stuff later, but let me give you some examples of his avatars. The ancient Nords and Admorans worshipped him as a fox deity, with all their gods taking some kind of animal form. It was basically the furry period of the Admorans. He apparently appeared to Ysgramor in this form to absolutely wreck Hermaeus Mora, who was in the form of a hare, and stopped old Ysgrim from turning into an elf. It's a long story, but he appeared in a much more proactive role in an attempt to claim his own heart. You see, when the Nords finally worked out where the heart of Shor was, the location being revealed by Dagoth they knew it was the perfect opportunity to make their dead god not so dead. So they summoned him, or I guess his spirit, to lead the Nords, and Orcs, because they were there for some reason, to take the fight to Morrowind. Shor also brought back an old Dragonborn hero, Wulfharth of Atmora, and remember that name, that'll come up later, to be his general. And the Nordic crew went over to the Red Mountain to claim Shor's heart, but it didn't really go too well. Ironically, Dagoth pulled a Shor and deceived the Nords. Long story short, Wulfharth, the Nords and Shor were defeated by a mix of the Dwemer, led by King Dumak and Kagranak, and the Kaimer, led by Indral Nerevar and the Tribunal. Shor was shoved under the Red Mountain and the Nords were forced to flee, but the Dwemer and Kaimer still had a lot of fighting to do. You see, when the Heart of Shor was discovered by the Dwemer, they sought to use it to power their artificial god, the new medium, and this Gundam of theirs was going to be used to make the Dwemer divine, returning them to Aetherius like the days of the Elnathay. But when the Kaimer caught wind of the situation, Nerevar raised his armies with the Tribunal to stop them. Ultimately, the Dwemer vanished following the Battle of the Red Mountain, and while Nerevar, Azura's champion, was slain, ambiguously, because Vivek, who was literally there the entire time, doesn't give us any details, the weirdo. The Kaimer technically won. They had the Heart of Shor and were the last ones standing. I mean, the Dwemer did vanish and the Norns did retreat, so I guess that's a win. But before his demise, Nerevar made the Tribunal swear upon Azura that they would not use Kagranak's tools, which he created to harness the power of Shor's heart, on said heart, which they promised and then promptly broke to make themselves gods. Yeah, good going, you three stooges, because this led to Azura cursing the Kaimer into the Dwemer we know today. This all ultimately ended with the plot of Morrowind, where Dagoth gets up from an extreme power nap, Nerevar gets reincarnated into the Nerevarine, Lord makes his own Numidium, tries to use the Heart of Shor, Nerevar too stops him, and then the Heart of Shor vanishes. I'm assuming it's not destroyed because Nern's still around, but I couldn't really tell you where it went. This ultimately means that Shor will probably remain dead forevermore unless he knows where the heart is. It's also interesting that Shor, a god who distinctly loves humanity, has had such a major impact on both the Dwemer and Dunmer. Quite frankly, he's had a massive impact on everything that has ever existed on Nern besides maybe the Hist, but I'm talking about after he died. Still, before we move on to talking about Shor reincarnating, I've got one more strange avatar to have a look at.
What?
That's disappearing guy. That's just what he does.
I see.
So, Shor has been known to be a bit of a foil to Alduin. He fought his brother, Akatosh, and I guess as Akatosh's firstborn, it makes sense for Alduin to tussle with the missing god, which they apparently did at the beginning of time. But the beef is so strong that not even one of them being shunted through time, and the other being dead, was enough to stop them from fighting. You'll remember I mentioned a Dragonborn hero from before, Wulfharth, who was revived to help the Battle of the Red Mountain, but the story of his first life and subsequent death is probably one of the funniest things I have ever read in Elder Scrolls lore, and that's saying a lot. Oh, Bylan 9, I love this story. Okay, so, Wulfharth was kind of a Chad, getting Skyrim back on track when he came from Atmora to rule the country, and with his incredible Thu'um powers had even swallowed a storm cloud, earning him the title of the Breath of Kine, like Morrowind before him. He was known to battle orcs, defeating one of their chiefs with a shout, and the orc god, Orkay, the Old Knocker, who is basically Arkay and Malika fused, and old, decided to do something about these pesky Nords. He summoned Alduin, bloody somehow, and Alduin used his mukbang skills to eat the Nords' time away, which turned everyone into a 6-year-old. Yeah, that's right, Alduin could have turned you into a helpless kid the entire time, but chose to actually fight normally. Now, a kid, Wulfharth then summoned Shor to fight Alduin. Again, somehow. Note that both are spirits at this point and thus fought on the spirit plane, but Shor was apparently the stronger of the two and defeated Alduin, then threw the child curse onto the orcs, which, I mean, what the fuck, man? You didn't need to do that, that's... Anyway, 6-year-old Warthalf witnessed the fight between Shor and Alduin, and thus figured out the Thu'um required to undo the time-eating curse. So he restored everyone back to their mortal ages, but died from using the Thu'um. And I guess Orke had enough and went home? My days, this is just so mental, and this is mainly because it's from a mythology. Other versions of this tale aren't quite as crazy, but this is the fun version, so it's the one you're getting here. But as you can see, Shor doesn't really know how to stay dead, and while he is a god, he is known to appear on Nirn as a mortal.
Your prayers have woken me from my endless dream. Or perhaps you have entered my dream, and I still sleep.
Gods having mortal avatars isn't that uncommon. Talos apparently had one in Morrowind, the game, called Wolf, but Shor is the most famous for it. These reincarnations even have a specific name, Shezzarine, but is hotly contested as to who is and who is not a Shezzarine. I'll give you 3 potential examples here, with example number 1 being this absolute maniac, Pellinor Whitestrake, the Divine Crusader. Pellinor was probably the most aware of his status, if he was one, often talking to a figure named Akka, most likely Akatosh, in his mad ravings. He hated elves with a passion, the passion of 3,000 suns, which makes sense if you consider that Shor has been at war with Myr several times in the past, and was also stupidly powerful, to the point where he fought Alkosh, basically Khajiit Akatosh, and got shouted out of the country but took no damage. I made a full video here about Pellinor, but it seems that if he were a Shezzarine, there was something broken about him, given his madness, which he was only freed from in death. Despite this look, which isn't all that Nordic, the Nords saw him and thought he was Shor in person, and some have even stated that Pellinor is Shor's corpse, given that he is described as having a hole where his heart should be. It seems that Akatosh left his mark on Pellinor too, with him being described as having the rage of a mindless dragon. Strangely, Pellinor hated the mention of being called Shor, and it only fueled his rage, but I'm not sure if this meant he denied it or just hated the idea that this is what he had become. Akatosh also seems to have quite a collaboration with Shezzarine, which could be a sign of the dragon god's continued torment of his twin, or perhaps his own grief at having lost his brother, with Pellinor being called as such in the Song of Pellinor, written in Remen Cyrodiil's time. Morrohaus the Man-Bull and the demigod son of Kain, who was Shor's wife, and now widow, had great love for Pellinor in a familial way, with the Crusader calling Bull Boy over here his nephew. Morrohaus even states that Pellinor would one day return as a fox, which we've established before as Shor's Nordic aspect, yet there is something wrong with Pellinor. He was mad, suffered bloodlust, and was so violent that when Aedra watched his rages and bouts of madness, they thought about leaving the world, which I think means Nirn and not Mundus as a whole. The Aedra literally can't leave Mundus because of their powers being used to make the world, but he appeared a few times in spirit form too, first to Alessia, the first Empress of Cyrodiil, on her deathbed, and then in Oblivion to get us to finish the job and finally deal with Umaril. Still, I want you to remember the fox tidbit because that will become relevant for the second Shezzarine I want to talk about here, Zurin Arctus. Zurin Arctus was the imperial battle mage of King Cuchulainn, a Colovian king who both he and the young Talos worked for. I won't go into extreme detail about this time because that's what this video is for. Man, it's nice having a backlog. But Zurin was a pivotal part of getting Talos to become Tiber Septim, Emperor of Tamriel. He is believed to have been a Shezzarine as well, with his Breton name being Arnand the Fox, which could be fulfilling Morahouse's little comment about Pelennor coming back as a fox. While he played second fiddle to Akatosh's blood, Tibus Septim, the Dragonborn, Shezzarine was incredibly powerful. When Tiber lost his voice, getting his throat cut by either an assassin or himself during Kulakain's assassination, depending on the version of the story you believe, Shezzarine was the one who created the Mantella, a gem with his life force, and this was used to power the Numidium. Note that the Numidium was originally intended to be powered by the heart of Shor, so it follows that Shezzarine's own heart, as the Mantella is sometimes called, would also work. Also note that the previously mentioned Wolfharth potentially has a big part to play here too, but again, the video from before explains that. I don't really have time to go into it here. Now you might find it surprising that I don't mention Tibus Septim being a Shezzarine, considering quite a few people think Talos is. And well, that's because I don't think he is as a mortal, but he is as a god. It's complicated, but basically there are many ways in which people can become gods. Achieving godhood is called apotheosis, and the methods are known as the walking ways, one of which is the combination of different beings to create a stronger whole, known as the enantiomorph. This usually involves one being overcoming another, and it is believed that the god, Talos, is actually made up of 3 people: King Wolfharth, Tibus Septim, and Shezzarine Arctus. This would mean that Talos, the god, is 1/3 Shezzarine, and could explain why he ascended to the 9 divines. Actually, some believe that Wolfharth is a Shezzarine too, so technically it could be 2/3 Shezzarine, but essentially, Talos, when he became a god, returned Shor to his rightful place in divinity, and thus the missing 9th god was found as Talos. There's even evidence that Talos mantled Shor, essentially taking his place, hence the 9 divines, but Shor and Talos seem to remain separate beings. Talos has sort of filled his position, but isn't literally Shor now, because it's not like Sovngarde belongs to him, I think. But then, this leads us to the final Shezzarine I want to talk about: us. The Last Dragonborn, aka John or Jane Skyrim, is thought to be not just the Dragonborn, but a Shezzarine, at least by a fair part of the community. It's not confirmed by Bethesda, because very rarely are things in a lore confirmed by the people who made it, and we seem to be linked more with Talos and Akatosh than Shor. But let's have a look at it. Shor was known to fight and even beat Alduin in the past, and after Akatosh's first Dragonborn failed to get the job done, Merak, it's somewhat reasonable that he would give the job to a Shezzarine with dragon blood to really make sure the job gets done this time. Akatosh has always had some sort of hand with Shezzarine in the past. Look at Pelennor and Wolfharth. Whether intended or otherwise, Shezzarine Arctus ended up working alongside a Dragonborn for most of his career, so it's not like Akatosh hasn't combined his powers with Shor in the past, and wouldn't continue to do so. The thing is, no one recognises us as a Shezzarine or even Shor, not even Sun, his close thane at the Whalebone Bridge, so it's not 100% guaranteed. Still, Shor isn't in Sovngarde, and while Kirkbride mentioned that this was because of religious reasons from another Bethesda dev, at least according to this Reddit comment, you could state that this is because we're literally him in mortal form. It's not a watertight theory, but you could use it. Another thing to mention is that many have said the hero of Kvatch is also a Shezzarine, because Pelennor was implied to be reborn as the hero during the Knights of the Nine, but that would mean there are 2 Shezzarine hanging about, since Oblivion's protagonist becomes Sheogorath after the Shivering Isles DLC. Actually, if you add Talos, I guess there are many, meaning that multiple Shezzarine can exist simultaneously. Actually, I've even seen people say that Nerevarine is a Shezzarine, but this is where I put my foot down. This is where I say enough is enough. The Nerevarine is already a reincarnating demigod, he doesn't need all of that. The biggest problem in general is that we don't know who exactly is and who exactly isn't a Shezzarine, so it's tough to confirm or deny if somebody is, especially if multiple can exist at once. Hell, even Ysgramor could have been a Shezzarine, since he went on a tear against elves and was said to cry ebony, which is Shor's blood. This would mean that Shor can interact with his Shezzarine, since he came to Ysgramor as a fox and interacted with Wolfarth on 2 separate occasions. Truthfully, the whole Shezzarine thing is just quite messy, and quite a complicated thing to wrap your head around, but his worship at least seems reasonably simpler.
Together snared, Stormcloak and Imperial, we wander hopeless, waiting for succor.
For the most part, people agree on what Shor is, and he doesn't appear wildly different between pantheons, and his worship depends on whether you're a Mer or Mer descendant, or a human. For elves, he is a deceiver, Lorkhan, the doom drum, but for humanity he is Shor, the children's god. Because he's dead and died so early in Nirn's history, temples aren't built in honour of him, nor his shield thane Sun, and while he continued to be an overlooking figure in Nordic religion, Kyne seems to be the one more actively worshipped, since she is very much still alive. I guess humanity, or at least Nords, see him as a martyr god, and in their own death, they will go to his Hall of Valor and Sovngarde, where he once again rules them as a king, similarly to how Auriel used to rule the Ealdmeri. While Nords worship him as a fox, then as a humanoid, I guess, he has been a stalwart for them until recently, when the people of Skyrim has switched up on him, but his worship among other humans is well documented too. The Needs, essentially precursors to Imperials, had a track record of worshipping Shor, even though he wasn't one of the 8 divines. I assume he isn't part of that pantheon because he was dead, but there are other interesting things about the name Shezzar, which was chosen for Shor. Alessia once spoke to Kyne and is quoted as saying, "And this thing I have thought of, I have named it, and I call it freedom," which I think is just another word for Shezzar, who goes missing. So to her and the Needs, Shezzar represents freedom, probably meaning freedom from her oppressors, the elves, which makes sense given that Shor loved to fight those pointy ears. Later on, when a monkey man prophet named Maruk introduced some extreme religious zeal, which resulted in monotheism, with Akatosh at their helm, they still stated that Shezzar should be revered. Strangely, some theorise that when Alessia made the 8 divines religion, she actually combined Auriel and Shor, the twins, into one being, Akatosh, and this could be where this stems from. Although this is all theoretical. We very rarely get proper explanations for any of this stuff in Elder Scrolls lore, but I guess that's what makes it fun. Annoying if you're making content like me, but still fun. Also, Shor, Auriel and Morrowind are all married to Alessia, according to the Remenada book, and Shor and Auriel are twins, so... let's move on. There isn't a whole lot to talk about when it comes to Lorkhan, the elven interpretation. The more traditional incarnations, now used by Altmer and what was probably the case with the Snow Elves and the Ealdmeri, make him a trickster, the enemy, and sometimes compare him to Sithis, which is a bit much. These guys feel cheated out of their godhood and immortality because their ancestors lost this divine power when Lorkhan tricked them into making the world. The Dwemer didn't really care either way, since they wanted to be gods in their own right and thought all gods that weren't them were dumb, or something like that, but the Dunmer seemed pretty cool with Lorkhan. To them, he was a cruel but benevolent god, and cruelty is sort of something that the Dunmer are chill with, and he was sent by Sithis to change the order of the world, freeing slaves from their false gods, the Aedra. This makes sense if you take into account the Dunmer's track record of Daedric worship. Bretons, who are sort of elves, just say he makes crops go bad. He's literally called the Bad Man, but they also call him Shor, not Lorkhan. From what I can tell, the Bosmer and Argonians don't really care that much. He exists in their pantheons, but he's far from the main focus. Now the Khajiit have a funny thing about Lorkhaj, their version of Lorkhan. According to these fluffy cat dudes, there's actually a third moon, known as the Dark Moon, appearing when there's an eclipse, and this third moon is Lorkhaj's corpse. Finally, we have the Redguards and their Yokudan traditions, calling Lorkhan Sep, a snake born of the shed skin of Sakatal, the world snake, who is basically a representation of everything, a mixture of Anu and Padme, which we'll explain later. Redguard religion and culture are pretty tricky to explain quickly, because it comes from a different continent and doesn't have a lot of the things that make Tamrielic religions harmonious, but Sep is characterised as a helper to another god, Ruptga, also known as Tall Papa. What the f is that name? He eats a lot too. Yeah, I'm gonna need a full video on Redguard culture and religion to make any sense of that, but finally we need to have a discussion about Shor conceptually.
Approach me, listener, and hear my words.
Okay, so Shor and Akatosh are twins, and yet polar opposites. They allied with different forces and are two sides of the same coin, forever intertwined, yet forever opposed. This could be why Shezzarine always seemed to be linked to dragons, dragonborns and so on, but why is this the case? Well, this is because of two opposing primordial forces in the Elder Scrolls, Anu and Padme, aka Sithis. Everything and nothing, order and chaos, stasis and change. From my understanding, Akatosh comes from Anu, and Shor comes from Padme, which is why there's this association between Lorkhan and Sithis. The world was in stasis before the creation of Mundus, and Shor upset that by introducing change and chaos. But what's interesting is that Akatosh did not abandon the project after discovering his twin's deception, as Magnus did before him. He sided with the Mer, the once divine beings, whose slow aging represents stasis, while his brother sided with humanity, the agents of chaos and change. He fought his brother, yet he did not destroy his project, nor leave it for others to finish, as Magnus did. Akatosh took charge and saw that Mundus was made, but why is this? Why, after being deceived, would he still give his power to finish a world that went against the nature of order? Well, maybe it's because, while the world changed with time, it contained everything. He and other Aedra were making everything, and this everything, this world, this Mundus, was more beautiful than even they, divine beings, et Arda, were. And perhaps this order and chaos, this beautiful combination of Anu and Padme, Akatosh and Shor, was the reason for this beauty. Shor may have begun as a trickster, but Mundus itself was no trick. Akatosh knew this, and while Nirn would pump his twin's blood as if it were its own, it was greater than any one god can be. Well, until Alduin eats it all anyway.
Yeah, baby! Whoa! I'm looking big. I'm looking mean. Whoa! I'm looking hot. Oh yeah.
Thanks for watching a video all about the missing god, with so many names. It's a tricky video to put together, arguably trickier than this Akatosh one because of the added element of Shor's reincarnation and how he's more consistent as a god. But because he's dead, the entire mythos around him is different. I didn't even talk about his relationship with Kain and the creation of men because of how much there is to cover, and all of it is equal parts confusing and compelling.
It makes no damn sense. Compels me, though.
This is what makes Elder Scrolls lore so entertaining in my opinion, especially with its gods. It's something it does so well. The gods are mystical, mythical, and there's so much to look into and figure out. The religions are unique and interpret the same forces as real world mythologies do. But it can be difficult to get the information across to viewers, annoyingly. That's kind of my only problem with this. Still, I hope you enjoyed this video. The YouTube ritual still needs fulfilling with the whole like, comment, subscribe, you get the ordeal, and perhaps I will see you in another video.
The wolf bore its fangs and spread its claws and tore at its own hide. Drink the blood and become my sons, or by dawn you'll never survive. And so the pack was born again as the Wolves of Jorrvaskr, to rule in life and serve in death as the moonlight's bound hunter. And so the pack was born again as the Wolves of Jorrvaskr, to rule in life and serve in death as the moonlight's dark hunter.